My mother-in-law sent me to an empty house on Thanksgiving. I made sure she spent Christmas alone. So, me and my husband Paul got married 3 years ago after dating for 2 years. His mom Linda never liked me from day one because I wasn't from their small town and didn't go to their church. She wanted Paul to marry his ex-girlfriend Bethany, who still lived 2 streets over from Linda and taught Sunday school. But Paul loved me, and we built a good life together in the city about 2 hours from his hometown. We'd visit Linda once a month for Sunday dinner, and she'd spend the whole time talking about what Bethany was up to and how successful she was selling real estate now. I just smiled and ignored it because Paul always shut it down when she got too obvious about it. This year was supposed to be our first Thanksgiving hosting at our new house. We'd been planning it for months and invited both our families. My parents were flying in from Colorado, and my sister was driving up from Texas with her kids. But then Linda called Paul crying 2 weeks before, saying her sister Ruth was really sick, and the whole family was gathering at Ruth's house for what might be her last Thanksgiving. She begged Paul to come because Ruth specifically asked for him. Paul felt guilty and asked if we could go there instead. I understood family emergencies, so I called my family and rearranged everything. My parents canceled their flights, and my sister decided to go to her in-laws instead. Linda said she'd text me Ruth's address since Paul was terrible with directions, and I'd be driving while he worked on his laptop. The day before Thanksgiving, Linda texted me the address and said dinner was at 2 o'clock. She reminded me 3 times not to be late because Ruth tired easily. We drove 2.5 hours on Thanksgiving morning to this address way out in the countryside. When we pulled up, the house was completely dark. No cars in the driveway, no lights on, nothing. Paul knocked on the door while I called Linda. She didn't answer. We walked around the house looking in windows and it was obviously empty. The neighbor came out and said nobody had lived there for 6 months. Paul called his cousin who said everyone was at Linda's house and had been there since noon. They were about to eat. When Paul asked about Ruth being sick, his cousin laughed and said Ruth was in Florida for Thanksgiving like she always was. We drove 40 minutes to Linda's house and walked in to find the whole family eating dinner. Bethany was sitting in my usual spot next to Paul's chair. Linda acted shocked to see us and said she must have sent the wrong address by accident. She said they couldn't wait for us because the food was getting cold. There were no extra chairs, so we had to eat standing at the counter. Bethany kept talking about how she helped Linda cook everything and how nice it was to have a proper family Thanksgiving. Linda gave her leftovers to take home while we got nothing. Paul was furious in the car and said he couldn't believe his mom would do that. But by the next day, he was making excuses, saying she probably got confused with all the stress of hosting. I knew exactly what happened, but decided to play the long game. 3 weeks later, Linda called to confirm we were coming for Christmas dinner. I told her absolutely we wouldn't miss it. She seemed surprised I was being so nice about Thanksgiving. On December 20th, I called Linda crying, told her Paul's company just announced emergency meetings in London and we had to fly out on the 22nd. I said we were devastated to miss Christmas, but Paul's job was on the line. She said she understood and she'd save us leftovers. On Christmas Eve, I posted pictures on Facebook of me and Paul at my parents' house in Colorado. We were decorating cookies with my sister's kids. Linda called Paul screaming about how we lied to her. Paul said we never told her we were going to London, just that we couldn't make Christmas dinner. She said she'd already told everyone we were coming and bought extra food. She'd even wrapped presents for us to open in front of everyone. Bethany was supposedly bringing her new boyfriend to meet the family, and Linda had planned to do a big comparison thing about how both her sons were doing. Except Paul's brother was stuck at his military base and couldn't come either. Linda spent Christmas dinner alone with just Bethany and a stranger, while all her relatives went to other houses. But that wasn't enough for me. I spent the whole week after Christmas sitting at our kitchen table with my laptop open, looking up everything I could find about Linda on social media. Paul kept asking what I was doing, and I'd just close the screen and say I was catching up on work emails. He wanted to drop the whole thing and move on, kept saying we got her back for Thanksgiving, so we should be the bigger people now. I told him being the bigger person was how we ended up eating turkey standing at a counter while Bethany sat in my chair. He didn't have an answer for that. Every night he'd bring it up again, saying his mom learned her lesson and we proved our point. I'd nod and agree out loud, but inside I was planning my next move because Linda needed to understand that messing with me came with real consequences. Paul started sleeping on his side of the bed with his back to me because he knew I wasn't done, and he was scared of what I'd do next. 3 days into January, Paul's phone rang while we were watching TV. He looked at the screen and his whole face changed before he answered. I could hear Linda crying through the phone from across the couch. She was talking so loud and fast that Paul had to pull the phone away from his ear. When he hung up 10 minutes later, he told me the whole family was mad at Linda for lying about us coming to Christmas. His aunt canceled the New Year's party she was supposed to host at Linda's house and moved it to her own place instead. His cousins were talking about skipping the monthly family dinners. Linda was crying that everyone was excluding her and treating her like she did something terrible when it was just a misunderstanding about the address. Paul's eyes got all sad and guilty looking, the same way they did when we passed homeless people on the street. He said maybe we should call her and smooth things over, let everyone know there were no hard feelings. I reminded him that she sent us to an empty house in the middle of nowhere and made us look like idiots in front of his whole family. I reminded him that we stood at a counter eating cold mashed potatoes while Bethany got served first and took home leftovers. He went quiet after that, but I could tell he was still feeling bad for his mom. The next morning, I woke up to 3 Facebook messages from Paul's cousin Estelle. The first one just said, "Hey." The second one asked if I had a minute to talk, and the third one was 2 paragraphs long. She said Linda was telling everyone that I forced Paul to skip Christmas, that I was controlling and manipulating him to keep him away from his family. Linda told them I made Paul choose between his mom and me, and that I was trying to isolate him so I could have him all to myself. Estelle said she didn't believe it, but other family members were starting to talk, and she thought I should know what Linda was saying behind my back. I took screenshots of everything and waited for Paul to wake up. When he came into the kitchen, I handed him my phone without saying anything. He read through the messages twice, scrolling back up to read parts again. His face went from confused to angry to this look I'd never seen before, like he was seeing something clearly for the first time. He called Estelle right there and asked her to repeat everything Linda said. After he hung up, he sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. He said he couldn't believe his mom was lying about me to the family, instead of just admitting what she did. I didn't say anything because I wanted him to figure this out on his own without me pushing him. That afternoon, Paul's uncle Lawrence called. Paul put it on speaker so I could hear. Lawrence said the whole family was upset about the Christmas situation, and Linda was taking it really hard. He suggested we all meet for dinner to work things out like adults, maybe at that Italian place halfway between our house and Linda's town. He said Linda wanted to apologize in person and explain herself, and he thought it would be good for everyone to clear the air before things got worse. Paul looked at me, and I could see he wanted me to say no, wanted me to be the one who refused, so he wouldn't have to be the bad guy. But I smiled and said that sounded great. We'd love to come and hear what Linda had to say. Lawrence seemed surprised but happy, said he'd set it up for Saturday night. After I hung up, Paul asked what I was planning. I told him I wasn't planning anything. I just wanted to hear his mom's apology. He didn't believe me. We spent the next 2 days barely talking, and when we did talk, it turned into arguments about whether I was taking this too far. He said his family didn't deserve to be dragged into our fight with his mom. I said his family watched us get humiliated on Thanksgiving and didn't say a word, so maybe they needed to hear the truth about who Linda really was. Saturday night, I got dressed in the same outfit I wore to Thanksgiving dinner, the nice blue sweater Linda complimented before everything went wrong. Paul noticed but didn't say anything. On the drive to the restaurant, I had my purse on my lap with printed copies of our flight receipts to Colorado. I'd booked those tickets back in November, right after Linda's Thanksgiving invitation, because I knew something was off about the whole Ruth being sick story. I also had an email from my mom confirming we'd planned the Colorado trip months ago, with dates and everything. Paul kept glancing at my purse like he could see through it. When we got to the restaurant, Linda was already there with Lawrence and his wife, plus Estelle and 2 of Paul's other cousins. Linda's eyes were red like she'd been crying. She stood up when we walked in and tried to hug Paul, but he stepped back. We all sat down and Lawrence started talking about family being important and working through problems together. Linda kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I waited until everyone ordered food, until the server left and we were all just sitting there looking at each other. Then I pulled out the papers from my purse and spread them on the table. I explained very calmly that these were our flight confirmations to Colorado, booked on November 18th. I showed them my mom's email from November 20th confirming we'd be there for Christmas. I said there was never any London emergency, never any last-minute work trip. We planned to spend Christmas with my family months before Linda even invited us to her house. Linda's face went white. Lawrence picked up one of the receipts and looked at the date. I said I was tired of being blamed for Linda's lies, tired of being called controlling when all I did was make plans with my own family. I said Linda lied about Ruth being sick on Thanksgiving, just like she lied about the London trip, and I was done being the bad guy in her stories. Linda started crying harder, not the pretty crying she did before, but ugly crying with her whole face scrunched up. She said she was sorry, said she didn't mean for things to go this far. Then she stopped and looked at Paul and said something I didn't expect. She admitted she sent me to the wrong address on Thanksgiving on purpose. She said she thought if I didn't show up to Ruth's house, if I looked unreliable and messed up the family gathering, Paul would realize I wasn't good enough for him. She thought he'd see that I couldn't handle family responsibilities and he'd start to question our marriage. The whole table went completely silent. Even the noise from the other diners seemed to disappear. Lawrence looked disgusted, like he'd just watched someone kick a dog. Estelle had her hand over her mouth. Paul's face was so white I thought he might pass out. He just stared at his mom like he'd never seen her before. Linda kept crying and saying she was scared of losing him, scared that he'd chosen me over her and the family. She said she knew it was wrong, but she didn't know what else to do. Then Bethany spoke up from the end of the table. I hadn't even noticed she was there until that moment. She said Linda had been telling her for 3 years that Paul's marriage was falling apart. Linda told her that Paul was unhappy, that he missed his hometown and his old life, that he'd realize he made a mistake marrying me and come back home. Bethany said that's why she kept coming to family dinners and helping Linda cook, because she thought she was being a good friend and waiting for Paul like Linda asked her to. She looked embarrassed, her face all red, and she said she felt stupid now for believing it. She said she didn't realize Linda was lying to everyone and using her as a weapon against me. She looked at me and said she was sorry, that she thought Linda was just a concerned mom trying to help her son. Paul's cousins started talking all at once, asking Linda how she could do something like that, saying they couldn't believe she'd been lying to everyone for years. Linda just kept crying and saying she was sorry over and over. Paul stood up so fast his chair fell backwards. He told his mom she destroyed any chance of having a relationship with him. His voice was shaking and loud enough that people at other tables turned to look. He said she'd been manipulating him his whole life, and he was done making excuses for her. He said when we had kids, if we had kids, she wouldn't be their grandmother, because he couldn't trust her around our family. He told her not to call him, not to text him, not to show up at our house until she was ready to give a real apology, instead of just crying and playing victim when she faced consequences for her actions. Then he grabbed my hand and pulled me out of the restaurant. I barely had time to grab my purse. We left everyone sitting there with Linda crying into her hands. We drove home in complete silence. Not the angry silence from earlier in the week, but something heavier and sadder. Paul's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. When we got home, he went straight to our bedroom and I heard the door close. I gave him 20 minutes alone before I went in. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his face in his hands, and when he looked up, his eyes were red. He said he'd been making excuses for his mom his whole life because his dad left when he was 10, and he felt responsible for her happiness. He said his dad walked out one day and never came back, and his mom cried for months, and Paul thought if he was good enough and stayed close enough, she'd be okay. He said he could see now that she'd been manipulating him since he was a kid, making him responsible for her feelings, and he was mad at himself for not protecting me better. He said he should have seen what she was doing to us, but he kept telling himself she was just struggling with him growing up and moving away. I sat next to him and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would make it better. We just sat there together until it got dark outside. My mom called the next morning after I texted her about what happened at the dinner. I thought she'd be happy that Linda got exposed, that everyone finally knew the truth. But instead, she asked if I felt better now, or if I just felt empty. I got defensive and said of course I felt better. Linda deserved everything she got. My mom was quiet for a second and then said, "Revenge usually feels good for about 5 minutes before it just makes everything more complicated." She asked if exposing Linda in front of the whole family made my marriage stronger, or if it just added more problems. I told her she didn't understand and hung up. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Paul's face in the restaurant, how broken he looked when his mom admitted what she did. I thought about how happy I felt pulling out those receipts and watching Linda's lies fall apart. But that feeling was already gone, replaced by this tired, sad feeling that sat in my chest like a weight. I realized the revenge high wore off really fast, and now I just felt exhausted. My marriage had this huge dysfunction hanging over it, and even though I'd exposed Linda, it didn't fix anything. Paul was hurting worse than before, and his whole family was a mess, and I'd helped make it that way. I told myself Linda deserved it, and she did, but that didn't make me feel any better lying there in the dark, listening to Paul breathe next to me. Linda's email came 3 days after the restaurant disaster. Paul's phone dinged at 6 in the morning, and he sat up in bed reading it while I pretended to sleep. I heard him take a shaky breath, and then he got up and went to the bathroom. The shower ran for almost 20 minutes. When he came out, his eyes were red, but he didn't say anything about the email until we were eating breakfast. He slid his phone across the table and told me I should read it. The email was 4 pages long. Linda wrote about watching Paul pack up his apartment to move to the city with me, and how she stood in his empty bedroom after he left and cried for 2 hours. She said every time we visited for Sunday dinner, she felt him slipping further away, and she didn't know how to stop it. She admitted she asked Bethany to keep coming to family dinners, even though Bethany had a boyfriend in another town and was never going to date Paul again. She said she knew it was wrong to use Bethany like that, but she thought if Paul saw what he was missing, what he gave up by choosing me, maybe he'd realize his mistake. She wrote that sending me to the empty house on Thanksgiving was the worst thing she'd ever done, and she knew it the second she hit send on that text message with the fake address. She said she sat at her dining room table that whole Thanksgiving watching Bethany in my chair and feeling sick about what she'd done, but she was too proud and too scared to admit it. The email ended with her saying she was ashamed of the person she'd become, and she understood if Paul never wanted to see her again. Paul watched me read the whole thing, and when I looked up, he asked what I thought. I put the phone down and said the email was nice, but words were easy, and Linda had spent 3 years showing me exactly who she was through her actions. Paul nodded, but I could tell he wanted to forgive her right then. He said she was his mom, and she was clearly struggling, and maybe we could work toward fixing things. I told him he could have whatever relationship he wanted with his mother, but I needed space and time before I was ready to be around her. He agreed and said that was fair. For 3 weeks, it worked okay. Paul would drive to his mom's house every Sunday after church and have dinner with her while I stayed home. He'd come back around 7 and tell me about their conversation and how Linda was really trying to understand what she did wrong. But then he started coming home later and later, sometimes not until 9 or 10 at night. He'd walk in looking exhausted and go straight to bed without eating the dinner I saved for him. One night in late February, he came home at almost 11, and I was still awake in the living room. He sat down next to me and put his head in his hands. He said trying to maintain separate relationships with me and his mom was killing him because his mom would ask about me and our life, and he couldn't talk about it without feeling guilty. Then he'd come home to me and I'd ask about his visit, and he felt guilty for spending time with the woman who hurt me. He said he felt like he was living 2 different lives, and he couldn't do it anymore. I didn't know what to say, so I just held his hand while he sat there looking miserable. 2 weeks later, I missed my period. I took 3 pregnancy tests in the bathroom at work because I didn't want to do it at home where Paul might see. All 3 tests showed 2 pink lines. I sat on the toilet in that bathroom stall for 15 minutes staring at the plastic sticks and trying to figure out what this meant for everything. I'd been so focused on being angry at Linda and protecting my marriage that I hadn't thought about what came next. Now there was going to be a baby, and that baby was going to have a grandmother who'd proven she would lie and manipulate to get what she wanted. I drove home in a fog and found Paul in the kitchen making dinner. I put the pregnancy tests on the counter next to the cutting board and watched his face change from confused to shocked to happy in about 5 seconds. He picked me up and spun me around and kept saying we were going to be parents. Then he put me down and his smile faded a little. He asked if I was happy about it, and I said yes, but I was also scared because we had to figure out what kind of family we wanted our kid to grow up in. He knew exactly what I meant. We stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about Linda and whether we could trust her around our baby. Paul said his mom had issues, but she wasn't dangerous, and keeping her away from her grandchild seemed extreme. I said it wasn't about danger. It was about teaching our kid that actions have consequences and that family doesn't get a free pass to treat people badly just because they're related. We went in circles for hours and finally went to bed without deciding anything. 3 days later, Paul came home from work early and asked me to sit down. He had this serious look on his face that made my stomach hurt. He said he'd been thinking about the baby and about us, and he needed me to try with his mom. Not for Linda's sake, but for his sake and for the baby's sake, because he couldn't handle being split between us while we were about to become parents. He said he wasn't asking me to forget what happened or to pretend everything was fine. He just needed me to be willing to work toward something better. Then he said, if I couldn't do that, if I was going to hold on to this anger forever, then we had bigger problems than his mother. His voice cracked when he said it, and I realized he was actually scared. I'd say no. I told him I'd think about it, but inside I was panicking because I wasn't ready to forgive Linda, and I didn't know if I ever would be. The next afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said hello and asked if this was Paul's wife. I said yes, and she told me her name was Ruth. Linda's sister Ruth. The one who was supposedly dying on Thanksgiving but was actually in Florida. My whole body went tense and I almost hung up, but Ruth started talking fast like she knew I might. She said she heard everything that happened at the restaurant and before that, all the way back to Thanksgiving. She said Linda called her crying after Paul cut her off and told her the whole story. Ruth said she'd known for years that Linda was controlling and manipulative, but she'd stayed quiet because Linda was her sister, and family was supposed to stick together. But she was done watching Linda destroy her relationship with her son, and she was done being part of the problem by staying silent. She said Linda had always been like this, even when they were kids, but it got so much worse after Paul's dad left. Ruth said Linda put all her fear and need for control onto Paul and made him responsible for her happiness when he was just a 10-year-old boy. She said she should have said something years ago, but she didn't, and now she was calling to tell me that Linda needed help and that Paul needed someone in his family to be honest about what was really going on. I didn't say much, just listened while Ruth talked. When she finally stopped, I asked why she was telling me all this. She said because Paul loved me, and because I was about to have a baby, and because someone needed to break the cycle of dysfunction in their family before it got passed down one more generation. Ruth called again 2 days later and said she wanted to arrange a meeting at her house with just me, Paul, and Linda. No other family members, no audience, just the four of us sitting down to talk honestly about what happened and what needed to change. I told her I'd talk to Paul about it. That night I brought it up while we were doing dishes, and Paul looked surprised, but said he thought it was a good idea. He called Ruth right then, and they set it up for the following Sunday afternoon. The week leading up to that meeting, I barely slept. I kept imagining Linda crying and making excuses and Paul falling for it and me being the bad guy who wouldn't forgive her. I played out a dozen different versions of how it could go, and none of them ended well. Sunday morning, I threw up twice from nerves, and Paul asked if I wanted to cancel. I said no because putting it off would just make it worse. We drove to Ruth's house in silence. Ruth lived about 30 minutes from Linda in a small house with a big front porch. She opened the door before we could knock and gave Paul a long hug. Then she turned to me and said she was glad I came and that she knew this was hard. Linda's car was already in the driveway. Ruth led us into her living room where Linda was sitting on the couch looking small and nervous. She stood up when we walked in but didn't try to hug Paul or say anything. Ruth told everyone to sit, and we did. Me and Paul on one couch and Linda on the other with Ruth in a chair between us. Ruth said we were going to talk like adults and everyone was going to listen without interrupting and nobody was going to cry or make excuses. She looked at Linda when she said that last part. Then Ruth looked at me and said I should start by telling Linda exactly how much damage she'd caused. I took a breath and started talking. I told Linda about sitting in that empty house on Thanksgiving feeling confused and embarrassed while she was at home giving my seat to Bethany. I told her about calling my parents to cancel their trip and how my mom had been so understanding even though I'd ruined their plans. I told her about standing at her kitchen counter eating cold turkey while Bethany talked about helping cook the meal I was supposed to be part of. I told her about spending Christmas at my parents' house and feeling guilty even though I'd done nothing wrong. I told her about watching Paul make excuses for her and feeling like I was losing him to his need to protect his mother. I told her about the restaurant and how humiliated I felt when everyone stared at us, and how watching Paul break down afterward hurt worse than anything she'd done to me directly. My voice stayed steady the whole time, and Linda just sat there listening with her hands in her lap. When I finished, she didn't cry. She just nodded and said she heard me and she was sorry. I looked at Linda and told her I was pregnant. Her face changed, got softer and sadder at the same time. I said she could either be a grandmother who respected boundaries and treated me like family, or she could be a stranger who got updates through Paul and never built a relationship with our child. I said the choice was hers, but I needed to know she understood what was at stake. Linda asked what I needed from her, and I was ready with my list. No more comparing me to Bethany ever again. No more surprise visits to our house without calling first. No more lying to family members about us or our plans. And she had to go to therapy because whatever was making her act this way needed professional help, not just promises to do better. Paul squeezed my hand while I talked. Linda looked at Ruth and then back at me. She said she'd do all of it. She said she'd call a therapist that week and she'd never mention Bethany's name again, and she'd treat me the way she should have from the beginning. Ruth asked if she meant it, or if she was just saying what we wanted to hear. Linda said she meant it because she couldn't lose Paul, and she didn't want to miss knowing her grandchild. She said she'd spent 3 months thinking about what she'd done and why she'd done it, and she knew she needed help. I didn't believe her completely, but I believed she was scared enough to try. Linda called me 4 days later to tell me she'd made an appointment with a therapist for the following week. She sent me a text after her first session saying it went okay, and the therapist wanted to see her twice a week for a while. Then she started sending me updates after every session without me asking for them. She'd text things like, talked about control issues today, or working on recognizing fear-based behavior. It felt weird getting these messages from her like we were friends or something. Paul said it was more self-awareness than she'd shown in years, so I should take it as a good sign. I didn't respond to most of the texts, but I read all of them. Over the next few weeks, Linda kept going to therapy and kept sending updates. She didn't call Paul as much, and when she did call, she'd ask about me and the baby before talking about herself. It was small stuff, but it was different from before. 2 months passed, and I was showing enough that strangers could tell I was pregnant. Linda texted one morning asking if she could take me to lunch, just the two of us. I stared at my phone for 10 minutes before responding. Part of me wanted to say no, but another part was curious if she'd really changed, or if this was just an act. I said yes, and we made plans to meet at a restaurant halfway between our houses. I got there first and sat in my car giving myself a pep talk. Linda pulled in 5 minutes later and walked toward the restaurant door without seeing me. I watched her for a second, and she looked older than I remembered, more tired. I got out and followed her inside. The hostess sat us at a booth in the back, and we both ordered water and looked at our menus without talking. Finally, Linda put her menu down and said she wanted to tell me some things. She talked about Paul's dad leaving when Paul was 10, and how she'd handled it badly. She said she'd made Paul her emotional support when he should have just been a kid, and she'd spent years using him to fill the hole his dad left. She said watching Paul move to the city and build a life with me made her feel like she was abandoned all over again. And instead of dealing with those feelings in therapy or with friends, she'd tried to control the situation by pushing me out. She said her therapist helped her see that she'd been treating Paul like a partner instead of a son and putting responsibilities on him that weren't fair. Her voice was quiet and steady, and she looked at me the whole time she talked. I listened without interrupting. When Linda finished, I sat there for a minute deciding how much to share. Then I told her about my parents' divorce when I was 12 and how messy it was. I said my dad had an affair and lied about it for months while my mom knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. I said watching my dad lie and manipulate and gaslight my mom made me sensitive to that kind of behavior as an adult. I told her that's why I reacted so strongly to the Thanksgiving setup, because it reminded me of my dad's lies and how powerless my mom felt. I said I knew her situation with Paul wasn't the same as my parents' marriage, but the feeling of being manipulated and lied to triggered something in me that made it hard to let go. Linda nodded and said she understood, and she was sorry she'd made me feel that way. We weren't suddenly best friends, and there was still awkwardness between us, but we were talking like real people instead of enemies. The waitress came and took our order, and we spent the rest of lunch talking about the baby and what I was craving and whether we'd found out the gender yet. It felt normal in a way that surprised me. When we left, Linda hugged me and said thank you for giving her another chance. I said we'd see how it went, but I was willing to try. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in months, like maybe this thing with Linda could actually work out. A few weeks later, Linda texted asking if she could come to one of my prenatal appointments. I stared at the message for a long time before typing, yes. Paul saw my response and his eyes got watery, and he hugged me without saying anything. The appointment was on a Tuesday morning, and Linda met us in the waiting room exactly on time. She brought a small gift bag with prenatal vitamins and ginger candies for morning sickness. At the appointment, she sat quietly in the corner chair while the doctor did the ultrasound. When the baby's heartbeat filled the room, Linda smiled but didn't make it about herself, or cry dramatically like I expected. The doctor asked about family medical history, and Linda answered every question clearly and helpfully. She mentioned Paul's dad had high blood pressure and her sister had gestational diabetes with both her kids. She didn't use it as an excuse to talk about herself or make the appointment about her feelings. When we left, she thanked me for letting her be there and drove home without asking to come to lunch or extend the visit. Summer passed and fall arrived, and suddenly it was November again. We decided to host Thanksgiving at our house this year. Linda called 2 weeks before and asked if she could bring someone with her. My stomach dropped thinking she was going to show up with Bethany again. But when Thanksgiving came and Linda walked through our door, Bethany was with her, but everything felt different. They both looked nervous. Before we even sat down to eat, Bethany asked if she could talk to me and Paul together. We went into the kitchen and Bethany apologized for everything that happened last year. She said she'd been dating someone from her church for 6 months now, and looking back, she was embarrassed about how she let Linda use her. She said she should have known better than to sit in my spot and act like she belonged in my place. She hoped we could all move forward, and she promised to respect our marriage and our boundaries. Linda stood there nodding and said she'd asked Bethany to come so she could apologize directly instead of Linda just passing messages back and forth. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. Christmas came, and this time Linda invited us to her house properly. When we walked in, there was a chair waiting for me at the table with my name on a little card. Linda asked what foods I was craving with the pregnancy and made sure to have ginger ale and crackers available. Paul's Uncle Lawrence pulled me aside and said he was sorry for believing Linda's lies about me trying to isolate Paul. 2 of Paul's cousins apologized separately for not reaching out after the Thanksgiving disaster. The whole family made an effort to include me in conversations and ask about the baby. It still felt a little awkward, and I caught Linda watching me a few times like she was worried I'd leave. But it was different from before. Real different. Our daughter arrived on February 8th at 6 in the morning. Linda came to the hospital 2 hours later and waited in the hallway until we said she could come in. She washed her hands twice and asked permission before touching the baby. When she held her granddaughter for the first time, she looked at me with tears running down her face. She said she was grateful I gave her another chance when she didn't deserve it. She said she was going to spend the rest of her life proving she could be the mother-in-law and grandmother we deserved. Watching her rock the baby and sing quietly, I actually believed she meant it.